Good afternoon. This is the after lunch, don't go to sleep session called Leveraging the Blockchain. My name's John Pettitt, and I'm moderating. My background is I've been doing all sorts of weird internet things for a long time. I've been sort of 30 years on the net. My two claims to fame: I was CTO at CyberSource, invented all of their original fraud technology. CyberSource got bought by Visa for lots of money. And I was VP of engineering at BitTorrent, so I have a fair experience in distributed systems. Well, I'm going to try and give these guys a hard time and ask lots of controversial questions and get them arguing about things. Keep everybody awake. With that in mind, our panel is Andrew Barisser from Assembly, Greg Maxwell from Blockstream, and Nicholas Thorne from Blocksign. I'm going to ask them each to sort of do 2-3 minutes of intro, and then we'll get into the discussion. Do you want to go first, Andrew?
Hi, everybody. Hi, so I'm a Bitcoin engineer at Assembly, and we're working on creation of equity and ownership between users around the world. So you can own a part of a profitable product and be paid part of the revenue stream from anywhere. And it's all insured on the Bitcoin blockchain. So I'm really interested in crypto equity in particular. Previously, I was a physics grad student and I left academia. And before that, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I experienced firsthand the inadequacies of third world banking. So I'm very happy to see Bitcoin. And my interest in Bitcoin, originally I dismissed it. I thought it was a Ponzi scheme. That was the very first thing I said. But it just snowballed until I couldn't help but work in it.
Hi, I'm Greg Maxwell. So I got involved in Bitcoin around 4 years ago. It originally caught my interest because a number of years before that, I'd proved distributed consensus was impossible. And so when Bitcoin persisted in not going away, I actually had to go in and understand it. So after that, I got involved, and I've been a developer of the reference client, Bitcoin Core, since then. And Bitcoin's just an endless fountain of interesting and important problems, so I enjoy working on it. I've worked in a number of other places immediately prior to what I'm doing now. I worked at Mozilla working on open codecs. I've done a bunch of work with Opus and Vorbis and Theora, and sort of attempting to disrupt the billion-dollar codec licensed codec industry. So I figured I'd up the game and go for maybe more like $1 trillion industry. Most recently, I work for, and I founded a company called Blockstream. And what Blockstream is doing right now is focusing on turning into reality some protocol proposals that we had come up with about a year or so ago about how you can build new systems that allow you to take Bitcoin, the asset, and transfer it onto alternative distributed Bitcoin-like blockchain systems in a way that's trustless, and then allow those assets to be transferred back. And this seems kind of odd. Why would you want to do that? And the reason to do it is to enable innovation. Because right now in Bitcoin, we have this sort of suicide pact of consensus, that the system works because all of its participants enforce uniform rules over the whole system. And that makes it very hard to innovate. So you can't have a nice cadence. And so when you innovate in the Bitcoin space, you have to do it with companies on top of the blockchain, usually. And those introduce centralization risks. So this technology that we're working on, it's called PEG sidechains, allows you to do more innovation at the cryptocurrency layer as well.
I'm Nicholas Thorne. I'm one of the co-creators of Blocksign. Blocksign is a blockchain service for signing contracts and entering into agreements. As kind of a very initial product, what we launched was a product that will feel very similar to a HelloSign or a DocuSign. But I think our aspirations, or I know our aspirations, are more broadly around using the blockchain to kind of unpack how we reach and record agreements, both in the United States and abroad. And we were talking earlier that an interesting stat that we throw out is that it takes something like 400 days to resolve a contract dispute in the United States, and that's in the United States. It's about as quick a system as there is. So we like to think about what the kind of core elements of entering into agreements are, and then use some of the really fascinating kind of record-keeping facets of the blockchain to kind of change that and make it more efficient and effective for everyone involved. We founded that company out of a digital certification, digital credential business that we had started. That's called Basno, and that what is relevant there is just that we had spent a lot of time thinking about how do you have kind of authentic records of important pieces of information, and specifically personal information. That kind of has shaped our view on how we at least think about this. I'll point out that maybe just to cover my own rear end, that I'm the non-developer in the group, and so I'm lucky enough to work with some very talented people who are probably more equipped to sit up here and rap technical with this crowd. And so instead what I kind of try to do is approach this from the perspective of, and I think it'll come up in some of these conversations, which is how do you get someone who's not going to understand necessarily the technology to see and feel the benefits of what it is, which is really incredible. And so I will happily punt from the get-go on the more technical questions, because the crowd here is very equipped to do that.
Which actually is a good setup for my next question, which is for the audience. How many people in here are technical background, so have some understanding of how all this works? How many are sort of from the money side, the banking side of the world? And okay, so we've got a fair mix. We'll try and keep it balanced between the two. So the first question I think I have for the panel is a blockchain or the blockchain, and why?
Yeah, I think this is really a defining question, and I think there's so much diversity of thought in the cryptocurrency world. There's so many clever people who want to innovate in different digital currencies, all these altcoins, Ethereum being a really salient example where really smart people have come up with a very clever, or going to come up with a very clever blockchain, but it's not the blockchain. It's another blockchain. It's parallel, and I think, I believe very very firmly that network effects in Bitcoin will dominate, and that in a world in which it's free and trivial to make another altcoin, another cryptocurrency, the only thing that's really valuable is a common standard. So I think for the strength of cryptocurrencies in general, there needs to be the blockchain, and everything should be derived from that.
So I suppose you're expecting me to disagree with all of that. No. Absolutely. So I think the answer isn't necessarily either or, though, right? You can have an answer of both. The reasons that the make sense are because of a couple of things. One, the network effects and the economic effects. Having a zillion altcoins doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because then they're fighting against each other rather than against the traditional inefficient things that they should be fighting against. And then the users of these systems face uncertainty from more liquidity risks, from more exchange rate risks, from more diversity. Who wants to adopt into a system, store value in it, and then find out, oh, no, it's not the latest fad? So that's all true as well. But on the technical side, the blockchain technology is probably the least efficient communication mechanism ever invented by man. It is almost comically inefficient. And this is something that I think came up a bunch when Bitcoin was first announced, that people looked at this and said, this can't work, this cannot scale. It turns out that the needs of doing this stuff, if you're real efficient about it, it can scale pretty well. But it's not because it isn't a pig. It's a pig. It's just that we've got big enough rocket boosters with our fast networks and fast computers today. But when we want to talk about taking Bitcoin to do more than just, say, settlement-grade transactions between larger institutions or large, high-value transactions between people, something has to be done other than just stuff it into a single blockchain, right? More scalability mechanisms need to be used, and there are many of them. Many of them are centralized, and those have their own trade-offs. So if there is a possibility to use multiple blockchains, then we can potentially achieve better scalability and a better pace of innovation. And so I think that with the sidechain stuff, that's what I've been trying to achieve. But otherwise, it should be the blockchain because we should be focusing our energies on a single point. Oh, and one thing I should have mentioned is that the security of blockchain crypto systems is very dependent on people using them, right? It's a consensus system. And so if a consensus system only has a few users, then a much larger majority can come and outnumber them. And so there's safety in numbers. And having systems which are completely independent doesn't necessarily achieve good security for any of them.
I agreed. Yeah, no, I guess, again, to take this from a slightly non-technical perspective, I think the safety in numbers is probably the key point in my mind, which is it's hard enough to kind of build consensus and momentum in general, and then if you're dividing that over many different terms and brands and words that people have to wrap their head around, just the IQ and the EQ required to kind of interface with that is very difficult. And so I think even where they're not these pretty compelling, I think, technical reasons why it's a better probably solution, especially where we can come up with some options for scaling it. I think from like a branding perspective and from just a human being understanding what they're doing and trusting these new systems, I think it's very beneficial for there to be one-ish. And so that to me is a pretty compelling reason.
If I could add one thing, it's that there's a really big distinction between side chains, which Gregory's working on, which I'm really bullish on, versus altcoins. And there's a huge distinction because with altcoins, a lot of them, they're like parallel universes in and of themselves where they have different rules that operate than in Bitcoin, which has its own set rules. And people can innovate what those rules are and get new features. But the problem is, if I want to go from the mainstream standard, which is Bitcoin, and have access to other kinds of features, other kinds of rules, like escrow, things that don't exist in Bitcoin, I have to go to a floating market with a floating exchange rate and experience volatility there and uncertain risk, right, by exchanging to another altcoin. And that disincentivizes me from accessing other kinds of features which innovative people are coming up with. With sidechains, however, they're pegged by definition. So if I move one Bitcoin into the Andrew blockchain with different laws, different rules, I can still go back to Bitcoin with one Andrew coin. So, I mean, in a sense, it's a surrogate for Bitcoin. Just I don't have to experience the risk to access that functionality.
Which I think goes to, this next question about, okay, so the blockchain's going to get really big if we all start using it. I mean, if you sort of say, okay, there's going to be, 9 billion people by 2050 or something, and they're all, the perfect world where everybody's using Bitcoin for everything. How big's the blockchain going to be, and how do we manage that?
Rocket boosters.
Yeah, bigger rockets. Yeah, so there's a couple of angles on this. One is that there are a number of really interesting technical tools available today to improve scaling. There just hasn't been need to. So for example, in the design of Bitcoin, it's possible to run prune nodes that don't know about the history. And they only track the current state. Code's all there for this in Bitcoin Core, but we haven't exposed the feature to the public yet. Because there hasn't been quite sufficient demand for it. So there's some scaling things we can do that are very easy, just sort of flip a switch to improve scaling. And then beyond that, there are many different approaches to how you structure the data in a blockchain that can enable things like fractional validation, so that no single system anywhere in the world has validated the whole thing, and yet you can be incredibly confident that the whole thing is valid. And these kinds of approaches require small changes in the design. And these are things we've been talking about since at least early 2011. But the problem with getting them deployed is a mixture of not enough demand and then also the Bitcoin suicide pact. Right? It's difficult to make changes in Bitcoin. Not impossible, but it's difficult. And it should be, because the difficulty in making changes also protects it against changes that are against your own interests. So it's a little difficult to go and develop and mature these approaches while all stuck on a single system that everyone's fate in the Bitcoin world rests on. So with the sidechain stuff, maybe we have some more opportunities to go build some of these technologies. And also some of the altcoins may eventually do something technically interesting and try some of these approaches to improve scaling as well.
I think there's also there's a free market of ideas here where it seems to me, maybe there's some clever technical solution that I don't know about. Gregory, you're the core developer, but it seems like there's a fundamental trade-off between how pure you want the decentralization to be versus the convenience. And I think it seems like Bitcoin has taken what I think is a justifiably extremely decentralized approach. For example, with proof of work, it's like a measure. It's a very pure measure as opposed to other ways like proof of stake or Stellar, which has trusted nodes. It's really taken to the extreme, which again I think is a good thing, the trustless angle. But there are significant inconveniences with that, and I think even with the pruned nodes that you've mentioned, you're introducing an element of trust. You're moving away on the spectrum from the extreme end of trustlessness. In a world where there are many blockchains or even many side chains that are pegged to another, there could be a free market of ideas where you choose what's most cost effective for you. How trustless do you want to be? How much inconvenience do you want to bear for varying levels of trustlessness?
So one of the challenges here is that security is a little bit of a lemon market or worse, right? In the sense that you often don't know that you're insecure until it's too late. And in a system which doesn't have a central authority to make things right after the fact, to unsort the mess that was created, it does favor being particularly conservative in the design. So some of the tools that we have, these technical tools, there's basically two ways they can help. One is some of them actually they're pure wins, right? They improve the scale you can get without reducing the decentralization, but they're limited in how far they can go because there's fundamental limits here, or so it appears. I've thought before that things were impossible. But the other way that they can help is by achieving different trade-offs, right? You don't need, incredible security for your cup of coffee transaction. Now, we already have a level of choice that's being widely used in Bitcoin today, which is that you can transact in the blockchain or you can move your coins into a centralized service and transact within it. And there are many centralized services that will clear transactions internally. And they can achieve instantaneous transactions at incredible throughputs. But you've got this liability now of your transactions left in the single point of failure. And so what I'd like to get to is an ecosystem that has more shades in between that. And maybe the highest scale will always be in a centralized system, which has some level of trust required in it. And in a good ecosystem that's done this in a mature way, good software can act appropriately on the user's behalf without having the user to have to micromanage all of these decisions. So if you want to pay for coffee, okay, well, you've left a couple of Bitcoins inside some centralized thing, and it does some magic along with that in the background to handle it for you. In addition, these centralized services can be made more secure than they are today. Right now, the state of auditing for this stuff is very, very not mature. We can take blockchain-like technology and apply it internally inside institutions to get very strong auditability and review to sort of boost the security of these centralized systems to be more Bitcoin-like, even though it's still trust-based.
Yeah, I mean, the speed with which the service provider stack and where they're kind of traditional service providers and what that looks like and where that's protocol level things. The speed at which it's developing is very robust and encouraging, right? But it creates a fascinating set of issues around, how consolidated is your risk at that point, and how much do you trust that organization, and when are we back to square one if part of the goal here is decentralization? So, so it creates a bunch of very interesting issues and topics, but I think you have to believe that whole spectrum gets filled out, and that creates incremental efficiency to deal with some of the problems.
Okay. So jumping for a second away from the technology and more to applications, those of you who are as old as I am might remember something called Gopher on the net. It was a protocol that predated the World Wide Web, and it was interesting but not particularly useful, and then along came Mosaic and the world changed. So the question is, what's the mosaic of Bitcoin or blockchain apps? Because right now it feels like we're at the Gopher stage. We've got this sort of thing and it sort of kind of works, but you have to be a bit techie to use it. What's the mosaic of blockchain apps?
I think, look, without getting too political, I think the strengths of Bitcoin will become most manifest where fiat currencies fail. The fact that there are only 21 million Bitcoins, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins is very powerful. The fact that the blockchain is, I think of it as this entity outside of us, right? It's not controlled by people anymore. It's the first thing made by people, not controlled by people. That's pretty amazing. Unlike fiat currencies, which are fully controlled by people, which, as I see it, is their weakness, right? It's the element of human discretion in the regular money we use, maybe its downfall. And I think currency crises around the world are inevitable. And there are 200 countries with so many currencies, it's only a matter of time until some of them blow up, as history has shown us. As fiat currencies exhibit their weaknesses, I think people will go to Bitcoin because they know, with the certainty that transcends human trust, that there will only ever be 21 million.
So I want you to imagine yourself as Joe Average in 1965, and someone tells you about this technology that enables computers to send messages to each other across long distances. Now, you might think to yourself, what use is this? And I think that that's a parallel with what we have in the Bitcoin world today. So Bitcoin presents some new ways of building systems and shows them to be viable to at least some extent. And it enables us to build new kinds of applications, new kinds of ways of doing business with each other. We don't yet know what all the implications of this will be. And I think if we knew exactly what the Mosaic application was, right, we'd build it, we'd have it. Because whoever builds that is going to be sitting on a lump of gold. So we're still exploring out and still learning about what this new tool allows us to do and what its limitations are. And there's a lot of enthusiasm in this space. I often see proposals where people suggest things to do on blockchains that I look at and go, well, that seems to serve no purpose whatsoever. But that's part of the process of learning where the things are useful and where they're not useful and figuring out what the risks and contours are. And once we figured out all of those, that's when we can expect to really start seeing the killer applications that make this into a life changer for a larger portion of the world.
And I think you see the wallet wars, or I don't know what the right word for it is, but the wallet providers kind of building momentum, and there's certainly the places where there's a lot of money being invested, and they're the kind of household names of this kind of community at the moment in terms of more business or more traditional feeling businesses. And I think it plays a huge role because, well, I mean, what does everyone here own? At least Satoshi. I mean, everyone have some Bitcoin in this group. You give or take, right? I mean, but maybe not even. And this is as early as bullish a group as there is, right? So I think getting Bitcoin into people's pockets, quote unquote, and having that core level built out is hugely part of the evolution that will take place. And so that's why I think those wallet providers, for the moment, certainly feel the most, like the consumer-facing application that is most necessary to kind of continue to advance on the kind of getting people involved. But whether that's the Mosaic or not, I think is a very different question. I mean, that's more like getting people their computers before they can then figure out what to do with them. But I think we have to take that step. We got to get a lot of people some Bitcoin probably, or give them access to it in some capacity. Yeah,
and some of this is resting on a bunch of other initiatives. I mean, to use Bitcoin in a serious way, you have to have a computing device. So when there's large chunks of the world that don't have computing devices or not literate, right, then Bitcoin's not very useful technology to them. Maybe useful in some little ways. But so I think we can expect to see that Bitcoin's success will grow, and blockchain technology in general will grow as computers mature, as networks mature, as more people get brought online.
And that I think that point is particularly germane in the context of Andrew's point that maybe where the benefit of Bitcoin is most manifest is in places where the currency is in the most risk, right? And so that the kind of confluence of those two trends, places where currency is at such a state of flux and the growth of computing devices in those places create a very exciting opportunity, I think.
Yeah, I think justifiably we think a lot about attracting users and making it easy for them and cool technical uses, and I'm all for that. But I think rarely, maybe it's a personality thing, rarely do we really think about, like, what are currencies? What is the long view, right? Over decades, over centuries. What is currency? The Iroquois had wampum, right? You guys know what happened to wampum? It's beads, right? The Dutch came in and started manufacturing wampum, right? Wampum used to be very intensive to make. The Dutch came in and manufactured it and inflated all of the Iroquois' money, and wampum stopped being money. And to think, what's currency over long time scales, and what role is missing right now? I think usability, technical issues are great, but Bitcoin does address a core use case of currency, in that it's better as currency because it's faster and it's cheaper. But it's also more, the monetary supply is stable.
I'll give you another way that Bitcoin is better as a currency. So right now, in these centralized trust-based systems that we use for money transmission in general over the internet, you can't decide whether or not to accept a payment without knowing something about who's paying you or the infrastructure that's paying it to you, right? You have to have some trust, and that trust can be compromised. So this has actually been a problem for people trying to build technology on the internet, building things like BitTorrent clients that do equitable sharing of value so that they compensate each other for the resources they use, building things like anonymity networks like Tor, which are sustainable. Because there isn't a payment system on the internet that works like the internet, that has the same low trust requirements of the internet. And systems like Bitcoin and Bitcoin itself can give us that. And that's a way that Bitcoin's a kind of money that's just sort of better than the alternatives we've used before.
So to push back on that, the other side of that is having a central referee lets you reverse decisions. And in a world where, to use my mother as an example, she simultaneously can't remember her password and will give it to people. Sometimes you need to reverse fraudulent transactions, and essentially Bitcoin's a bearer currency, which makes that impossible. Do you think that'll actually become a barrier when it sort of gets down to the masses?
It is, and we fixed it. But not in practice yet. Let me explain. So there are a bunch of properties that a currency can have that are interesting, particularly because once you have those properties, you can build more properties on top of them. So irreversibility. If you don't have irreversibility, you can't get irreversibility. But once you have irreversibility, you can layer on top of it things to get you reversibility, right? It's a building block. So in the case of Bitcoin, you can create multi-signature transactions to do escrow payments. And there's a website called BitRated that basically facilitates you've got a buyer and a seller. The BitRated website will introduce you to someone who will act as an arbitrator. And you do this payment which says, this payment is good only so long as two of these three people, the buyer, the seller, and the arbitrator, two of three of them sign off on it. This is something people are using in Bitcoin today. Now, making this usable and available to Joe user is a challenge. But the nice thing about it is now, okay, you get reversibility, but it is the reversibility on your terms, by your choice, with an arbitrator you trust, who's available in your jurisdiction, who's following rules you set up in advance. And so we don't have to have the whole world agree on one set of arbitrators. Individual transacting parties can pick them out for themselves.
Or many arbitrators, right?
Yes.
And so the huge scale and the ability to not just have that be one person, but many people or computers for that matter. And I think there's a huge opportunity.
There's some technical challenges in making it work for more than 20, but
Gregory, I think you hit the nail on the head. But I think the takeaway point is that while native Bitcoin is a bearer item where if you make a mistake, it can be catastrophic. It's a free market. Again, it's a free market where you can essentially pay intermediaries to mitigate your risk. I mean, you're alluding to this, but like for instance, Coinbase. I'm not plugging Coinbase, but Coinbase, to my knowledge, I think they have insurance actually on their Bitcoins. Is that right? They've insured their Bitcoins in a third party. So if I store Bitcoins with Coinbase, I pay fees to them, but I benefit. I sustain less risk. So I think in practice there will be a large spectrum of free market where I can choose varying degrees of irreversibility.
And by having the currency, the features of the currency be more programmable in the context of what you described, you just have way more creativity and the ability to kind of solve that problem once you have the irreversibility baked in. But
yeah, and that stands in contrast to the way it is now, where I don't really have a lot of choices. Like I pay extra 2 or 3% to all my merchants because I pretty much have to use a credit card. I indirectly incur a lot of costs that come with regulation, and I don't have any choices.
So, Bitcoin, based on cryptography, specifically based on hash algorithms. Every hash algorithm so far has fallen at some point. SHA-256 is still out there, but the rest have all had issues. What happens when SHA-256 gets broken?
So there's a thought experiment that I like to engage in a lot when looking at various cryptographic systems like Bitcoin, which is to say, what if you take this system and replace all the parts with broken parts? So you take Bitcoin, you replace the SHA-256 with MD5, which is a modern hash algorithm that's been substantially compromised. And it turns out that Bitcoin's design is relatively conservative. And so if we had used MD5 in Bitcoin today, it wouldn't be a catastrophic break. Obviously, we'd want to move off of it. But it would result in DOS attacks. It wouldn't allow people to steal coins. Because the compromises in MD5 only allow fast collisions. They don't allow arbitrary second preimages. So you can't easily find a new message that has the same hash as an existing message. But you can find two messages that have the same hash. So one element is I feel relatively confident because the kinds of breaks we've seen in hash functions today are ones that Bitcoin is relatively robust against. The other kind of confidence I have is that when we talk about a cryptosystem break, getting consensus, and I mean consensus in pretty much the strongest possible sense, to make a change is easy. So a lot of the challenges we have with innovation in Bitcoin really don't apply. I mean, if the choice is the system stops working or everyone applies some update that swaps out a hash function for another hash function or swaps out a signature system for another signature system, it's easier to do that. And I don't. This one doesn't keep me up at night. I mean, it maybe kept me up in back in 2010, 2011, but it doesn't keep me up at night anymore.
So while I'm digging into things that might break it, mining concentration. Right now
This one keeps me up at night.
five or six big mining groups, and they're making 99% of their money generating new bitcoins. At some point, you're not going to be able to have 21 million bitcoins, and that'll be the end of that. And they're going to have to make their money on transactions. Do we end up with a dangerously low number of miners? Do the transaction fees go up to the point where it starts making some of the business models unsustainable? What happens?
Yeah, I think this is something people don't think about is, what's the steady state outcome for Bitcoin stability, not a few years from now, but 10 or 20 years from now? Because if it really has value, it needs to last decades. And this worries me also quite a bit. I think the 51% attack is the really most serious, most real threat that Bitcoin has, much more than anything else. I don't know. I mean, Gregory, why don't you address that?
Yeah. So, there's a bunch of tools, and we're not sure yet. So let me break this down a little bit. One problem is related to the long-term economic incentives, right? Bitcoin security depends on participants coming in and using their computing power. But forget computing power for a moment, right? Bitcoin is a consensus system. A consensus system has some majority, right? It does what the majority says to some extent. And so you need to incentivize people to participate, because if they don't participate, then it can easily be overrun by someone else. So the idea behind Bitcoin presented initially is that Bitcoin would give out its fixed supply of Bitcoin, and miners would also receive, and this would be awarded to the miners, to the participants who are putting in the work to make the system irreversible, to incentivize them to do this work. So we have a clear incentive in why people would honestly participate in the system. Miners would also receive transaction fees that are provided voluntarily by people making transactions. If they don't provide a fee, the miner has an option of just not including the transaction in the ledger that they're producing. So this sounds plausible, but it's a little fuzzy, right? What levels of security are actually required in the long term? How do we know that transaction fees will be high enough to pay for that level of security? So these economic questions are unanswered, and we're going to have to feel them out as time goes on. What we have now is basically an argument that there's a plausible way for this to work, but no guarantees on that.
But to your point on irreversibility, I mean, at least the system being as elegantly designed as it is to have the capacity for transaction fees, there is the option that is economic to continue to do that and creates a competitive market in which that continues to happen. And it is at least a force counter to the direction of kind of consolidation and oligarchy formation that, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. If we knew it was going to happen, that would be a different position. But we know that the system is built in a way where the economic incentives can be put in place. It may create drastic differences in how we think about any given right to the blockchain or anything like that. But the system is built to at least allow this to evolve.
Right. As I said, it's plausible, just not
Yeah,
proven yet.
sure. Well, if mining as it exists today weren't such a good quote unquote business, then we would start to learn more about that sooner.
Now, on the other side of this, ignoring the long-term incentives, there's the question about consolidation in mining that we have today. It's unclear what the real level of consolidation is, because there's a lot of Bitcoin participants who are just trying to get the coins. They basically hand over their votes to these mining pools. But the way they're handing over their votes can be moved away at an instant. So it may look like there's only, 6 large entities and thousands of small entities voting in the process. But the capacity of those entities to do something bad is not infinite. And so it's unclear how bad the case is today, although it's not great. Part of the problem is just education. I like to point out to people that with the huge growth and interest in Bitcoin, the average amount of time someone has spent involved and exposed to Bitcoins may be on the order of 6 months, just because it's grown so fast. And so we have an immature ecosystem. And as we educate more people, I've seen miners go, oh, yeah, maybe I don't want to be delegating my vote to this big pool. I should do something else. So there's an education component there. There's another tool that we can use Bitcoin itself to help with, which is that there's some commodities, there's some advantages of scale in mining, where it's easier to build one big data center than 2 smaller ones. There's some disadvantages of scale, which is that it's harder to dissipate heat when it's concentrated in one spot. In terms of addressing these commodities of scale, we've seen huge mining centralization in Iceland, where power is really cheap because they have geothermal power. And this creates some problems where you have these big data centers with tons of miners, and some ninjas come in with guns and seize the place. This could be not good for the Bitcoin ecosystem. So there's some tools we can do. One of the things that people talk about in future applications of Bitcoin and the blockchain are things called smart property. This is the idea that you build devices like cars or things that know who own them and can conditionally transfer their ownership based on a transaction. So this says, the device says, I will only respond to somebody that has this key, and then you make a transaction on the blockchain and its ownership shifts to another party, and it sees the transaction on the blockchain and abides by that. So we can build smart property miners. So miners, you can centralize the location of the miner, but the control is distributed to zillions of people all around the world, and going and taking over the physical plant only lets you shut them down. And so that's one of the other things that I've been working on, is working with some mining vendors to design protocols for smart property miners.
That's a really smart solution, actually, I have to say. Another economic fact to consider, actually, is that right now, the scalability issue, 99% of mining income comes from the automatic block reward and not from the transaction fees. It's like 99%, so it's overwhelming. So this goes to the point of what happens in 10 years when the automatic block reward is so much lower, exponentially lower. Where do the sufficient requisite transaction fees come from? Because overwhelmingly right now it's from this short-term source of Bitcoins, the automatic block reward. On the other hand, consider, sure, there are risks, right? There are risks, plausible technical risks to Bitcoin, but consider that vis-a-vis the potentials and the current market cap, right? If you weigh the potential upside versus the current market cap of Bitcoin, I think it's very favorable. I mean, do you guys know what is the current market cap of Bitcoin? It's about 4 billion, right? 4, maybe 5. 4 billion, a quarter of which are out of circulation. So really it's an overwhelmingly large potential upside given the potential risks. So
Latching on the out of circulation stuff, people are notorious for losing passwords, and keys are much longer than passwords. And there's only 21 million Bitcoins. At some point, won't we hit a point where everybody's lost all the keys, or a significant percentage of Bitcoins are actually lost because somebody's lost the private key?
So I guess one way to look at this differently is to say, well, there's not really 21 million Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin in the existing system today is divisible to 8 decimal places. There's really like 210 trillion Satoshi. So there's a fair amount of divisibility left in the system, even if large amounts of Bitcoin are lost. There's still enough Bitcoin for every person on Earth, even if all but one Bitcoin were lost today. And if we did run out of precision, right, with that so many Bitcoin were lost, some disaster occurred, that the granularity was becoming a problem, I think that falls into something like these security exploits, where it would be very easy to get consensus for people to revise their software to add some more digits of precision. From a technical perspective, adding more digits of precision is very straightforward.
So that also comes to another case where you can lose Bitcoin, which is that somebody steals it from you. And, in today's world, the courts, for whatever reasons, will enforce giving things back if they can, if it's within jurisdiction and so on. Obviously not doable in the Bitcoin world once you've signed off with your escrow and stuff. Do you think that is going to be a problem down the line? Do you think that the inability to compel payment is going to be a problem?
Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but if somebody puts me in a jail cell, I'm going to pay whoever they tell me to pay. So I think it's the case that we do have the ability to compel payment in Bitcoin. It's the same as our ability to compel payment of cash you've hidden someplace. It's a matter of you have to track down the person to compel, and then you have to compel them. Maybe since we do things with Bitcoin online, it's a little harder in that environment. But I think it's fundamental, and it's something that we have to deal with as a society and come up with good tools for dealing with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's going to be an interplay here between this technology and the regulatory environment and the legal environment and the systems that are in place to do these things. They're not going to just disappear necessarily, or in fact, they won't disappear. They'll be there. And the question, in large part is how can we, in fact, you just created more efficiency from those existing systems, but they don't have to go anywhere, and you can still enforce in a lot of the exact same ways. You just do it with an incredibly powerful technology underpinning it that makes it much more effective when push comes to shove and you actually have to do that. And you have to go enforce. I mean, talk about, you have to go enforce a contract. If you have a perfect record in the context of what we're talking about, it's just a lot easier to understand what was meant to be.
And as for the issue of losing your Bitcoins, like, there are many ways to make big mistakes with Bitcoin, and you can have major individual risk. But I would argue that there's a really big difference between having individual risk, which is compartmentalized to you and your choices, versus systemic risk. And I think, technical issues aside, with Bitcoin, you suffer very little systemic risk. Whereas I think with regular fiat money, the real value of your money is highly coupled to what other people do, over which you have no control. And like, in general, you have a lot more systemic risk with dollars than you do with Bitcoin. And we see this in many ways. Like, I mean, like bank failures, for instance, or huge massive identity theft with credit cards. You are not fully in charge of your money because they're bearer items. Whereas with Bitcoin, the risks are there, but they're compartmentalized.
Well, I would say, though, that there can be advantages in socializing certain risks. And I think that if I could have come up with a way to make it so that blockchain reorganizations could only cause inflation and not theft without actually encouraging blockchain reorganizations, I'd probably be promoting a design that did that, because sometimes it's useful to socialize a risk. I think that with great power comes great responsibility, and Bitcoin gives us more options, and so we need to navigate that landscape.
It's on a spectrum, right? Because just listening to Greg talk, right? I mean, you're raising these problems, and he's talking about a group of people, and it's a big community, but who are capable of making changes to this system. And so, vis-a-vis the chairman of the Federal Reserve and his cronies, I mean, it's not quite the same thing. But you're talking, it's on a spectrum here of how auditable, how rather modifiable is this system, and there's still a group of people who can make adjustments.
That's still very strictly limited.
Yeah, for sure.
No,
but I'm just we're on a spectrum here.
I'm going to move us to audience questions and see. We'll have a microphone that's coming around. If you have a question, stick your hand up. Say your name. Questions rather than speeches, please. Anybody? Nobody got questions? There we go.
I'm Rohit. Quick question. Could you expand a little bit more about the last statement that you made, Greg, on inflation and socializing? Like, it would be good to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Right. So right now in Bitcoin, if there were some bad event where a consolidated miner decided to rip some people off, and the way these attacks would look like is I would pay you, and then I go and use my captive hash power to unpay you, to reverse that transaction or replace it with another one. Now you end up not getting paid now, and you suffer a loss. Other people, however, don't suffer any loss because they weren't the parties being attacked. Now, this risk that occurred was a risk of the whole system, right? It's not your fault. That's assuming that you weighted some reasonable threshold of confirmations. It was a risk to the Bitcoin system. And unfortunately, the participants in Bitcoin may not be adequately incentivized to fight that risk because only the person who gets hosed in that transaction takes the cost. So if it were possible to construct a system where, say, the supply of coins was increased by this sort of attack, then that would force everyone to take the cost, and it would also incentivize people to put in more effort to prevent those attacks. But I don't know any way of accomplishing it. The obvious ways don't work.
More questions?
So this one's probably for Greg. Do you feel that the Bitcoin core dev team is centralized at this point in time? And if so, how do you think that may cause impact through the devs being involved in corporate products, like corporations?
Sure. So it's by definition centralized in the sense that you can just enumerate the participants, right? I think the bigger question is, to what degree does that matter, and to what degree should it matter? Ultimately, in sort of the ideal spherical Bitcoin, right, it doesn't matter what the developers of the reference client say. If they propose something and it's good, people will take it. What matters is what people run, not just the miners. What matters is what everyone runs, because miners can't just unilaterally change the rules either. So that's the ideal. The reality is, my experience in the Bitcoin space is that a lot of the companies in the space, a lot of the individuals, they have their own concerns, and they're too trusting. They're not participating and following the development enough. And encouraging them to do so is a requirement for sort of making true on the promise of Bitcoin and reducing some of the risks. That said, we've got good evidence that there is not as much review as I'd like, but there is lots of review and lots of additional voices. So it's impossible for me to say that bad things can't happen, but I think the structures are there to prevent them, and we need to do more to strengthen them to make sure that bad things don't happen.
Vis-a-vis where we are today, how would you rate the strength of the network? Both, in each of those tiers that you mentioned, the developers, the miners, the broader nodes. How would you benchmark that?
I think the biggest problem right now is, I think the mining ecosystem is the one that's the most messed up in that respect. In terms of the development stuff, it's merely a problem of more resources being put to it. And to actually tie in the other half of your question here, part of the reason that I founded Blockstream was to figure out how to get more investment in infrastructure work. It's difficult to monetize infrastructure work. And so there's a lot of companies doing things in the Bitcoin space and doing relatively little infrastructure work. So I think that there's risks involved with having some kind of commercial interest doing this work, but there's incredible benefits because people have to feed their families. And if your option is to just be an open source developer or to not be a developer on the stuff, well, choices are limited.
I think also everything's been kind of hunky-dory so far in terms of, I think, it seems like the unity of the protocol because it seems like the core team has been very conservative and haven't made very many highly opinionated choices. But again, do you think in 20 years, is it impossible that there could be some extremely controversial or opinionated design choices? Certainly possible. Like what if a national government had made their own Bitcoin fork? I think there could be very large disruptions if there were a seriously controversial fork. We have no idea. That could make for a really cool action movie, actually, maybe a cryptocurrency civil war, right? But the more doubt there is in the unity of the protocol, the less valuable it is. So I think it seems like the core team is very aware of that, but
Yes.
I don't know if it's really stable over long time periods.
I think all of us working on this have our own pet opinions that we suppress very heavily. And because we're aware of the value of the system comes from its decentralization.
It's like benevolent dictators, though. I mean, how long are we going to have George Washington's in command, right?
I'm not so skeptical about this. I mean, it is really, it's not that like, we're so great or whatever. It's that the incentives are right? Like, no, you don't know me. I'm actually quite evil. But the incentives of the system are such that like I can't succeed in my evil by being evil. I have to be nice because that's how it works. And so I'm actually relatively confident, but not completely sure, that we can expect to see this kind of thoughtful stewardship in the development of core Bitcoin infrastructure in the future, because there's no payoff in the system. If it can become decentralized, if it can become centralized, it becomes worthless, because the system's actually, Bitcoin itself is a very inefficient, from a technology perspective, a very inefficient way of doing payments. The value comes from the decentralization that nothing else can match.
More questions? One over there.
Bitcoin needs developers. That's pretty clear. Does Bitcoin need a foundation?
I was very unhappy that the Bitcoin Foundation called itself the Bitcoin Foundation, because I think it promoted a misunderstanding that this was an authority that spoke on behalf of Bitcoin. No one speaks on behalf of Bitcoin. But otherwise, Bitcoin Foundation's done a bunch of really interesting stuff. I think that I was involved in Wikipedia very early on, and there was a big debate over whether or not there should be a Wikimedia Foundation, a nonprofit that ran the servers for Wikipedia. This is actually how I got into the argument that caused me to prove that decentralized systems were impossible. Decentralized consensus was impossible. And people were arguing, no, Wikipedia should be just like, it should be distributed like BitTorrent, and there should be no organization. But it turns out that there's a lot of traditional institutions that need some impedance match. They need something to stand in between that looks like a centralized organization to help speak the language. And Bitcoin Foundation's done, I think, a generally pretty good job with that stuff.
Yeah, we were talking backstage about what are the sets of institutions that if this is this fundamental technological revolution, what are the types of organizations, and they'll all have very different incentive structures, and so whether it needs a foundation is probably different from how many foundations does it need?
Yeah.
Probably many, and in many shapes and forms, and that stack is growing very quickly. But I think that the answer is many, not one.
Yeah.
Anybody more questions? One over there.
I'm Joel Dietz, founder of Swarm. I'm curious, obviously there's been a lot of back and forth within the Bitcoin community over second generation technologies and altcoins, and particularly the use of funding via these coins, and even a kind of larger with a sort of conflict with some tension between supporters of sort of Ethereum and what they're doing, and kind of the main chain and all of that. And I'm curious, it seems like one of the benefits from my perspective, obviously we're facilitating some of these things in these other sales, is that they really help you bootstrap your community as well. So you have a lot of people who are incentivized to kind of spread what you're doing, and kind of, I came back from the Ethereum Dev Summit in Berlin, where, a whole bunch of people flew from all over the world to be there because they really believe in this kind of technology, and they're just kind of contributing. And I'm kind of curious, it seems like that's a big benefit, and I'm kind of curious from the standpoint of Blockstream and Assembly why you guys chose to go with traditional venture capital models, because it seems like there's a little bit of a potential conflict of interest there, in the sense that the people who benefit ultimately from your success aren't going to be the people who are using it, and the kind of other models that are out there now are from things. I know this is a sort of controversial topic, but I thought I'd just put it out there and see what you guys thought about that.
Okay, so Assembly is using crypto equity, and I know you're from Swarm, which is a similar kind of mantra. We're using a different approach. I mean, we're using it because we developed it in conjunction with the founder of the protocol, who's in Ireland, I think, because we wanted to use it, and there's not very much out there. But I think everything we do is open source, right? There's nothing hidden, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be valuable. So I think However, some of these other funding models, like you allude to Ethereum, I think people should be free to make their own choices to buy Ether, for example. And I'm interested in Ethereum, but I think you're often selling hope and castles in the sky a little bit. And I think people are free to do what they want, but I think it's slightly unethical to sell a dream a little bit.
I would point out that when we're talking about these systems, we're talking about crypto systems, systems whose success, whose safety depend on very subtle details that sometimes take years of the brightest minds working hard trying to figure them out. And it's very hard to say who is competent to assess the value of these things. Often I look at these systems and say I'm not competent to assess the value of this system or that system, because it's so easy to have this fractal complexity, and you can't tell if it's secure or not, you can't tell if it'll last or not. I support people's ability to self-determine, but I share these sort of ethical concerns with doing that. And I prefer, if there's risk, that it be consolidated in folks that are most equipped to handle it. In the case of the Blockstream stuff, the work that we're doing is not likely to produce trillions and trillions of dollars of value anywhere in the near term. So I don't cry too much over the risk that maybe some people will be left out. I hope that instead what we can do is pay back the users of the system by giving them good technology that they can build their businesses on, and that they can count on and depend on and benefit from in many different ways.
So I got a wrap-up question for you. It's a two-parter. One, Blue Sky World, what's the coolest thing you can imagine doing with the blockchain, if you don't quite know how to do it yet? And the other part of it is, who's going to be the blockbuster video of this world? Who's going to get killed by this?
I think one of the most compelling uses of Bitcoin is one that seems to me hardly ever used, which is by machines. I mean, like, Bitcoin is a natural tool for machines, not for humans. It is difficult to use in its current incarnation. That could be changed, but Bitcoin makes a lot of sense for machines. What I work on, which we haven't really talked about, which is colored coins, where you can create a digital token. Actually, Gregory alluded to this. You can create a digital token which inherits the properties of Bitcoin, and that it's just as easy to transact, it's just as secure as Bitcoin because it's built on Bitcoin, but it represents something like shares in the company, or tickets to an event, or the right to open a door, the right to operate mining equipment. These sorts of tools, I think, lend themselves naturally to machines. Gregory gave an example where a mining machine could recognize who owns it on the blockchain. You could have cases where machines own other machines, right? A machine could bid another machine for rights to use it, or a machine could own another machine. I mean, it's mind-boggling, and we've scratched the surface in that area.
And who's going to get killed by this?
I want a drone bodyguard, so I own cryptographically. But we'll see about that.
Yeah, so I share a lot of the same interests there. Like you took my answer, thanks. But there are a lot of challenges in applying this technology to new areas. Often you build this nice decentralized system that can, the blockchain is like a narrow AI that is immune from human influence. And that has some interesting and scary implications as well. But the problem is that it doesn't have any way to do I/O, right? It can't read about the real world in a trustworthy way. So this question allowed things that aren't possible yet. I think that a lot of the applications we can do with blockchains would be much more powerful if we came up with ways to allow them to do trustworthy I/O, and so that all of these computers that are acting based upon blockchains could also do so with respect to things about the real world, like this contract pays off if it rains in Brazil, right? Which you can't do trustlessly today. As far as what's going to be the businesses that are put under the bus by this, well, what I would hope from this technology to deliver, and what I think it has the potential to deliver, is removing some of the, particularly when we talk about this machine-to-machine stuff, when you remove the level of trust required, you remove some of the advantages in large consolidations. So why is a large consolidation? Why is it good to do business with a huge company rather than a small company? A big reason for that is trust. And so I think that existing companies will adapt. I think that the businesses that would disappear would be ones that uniquely facilitate larger consolidations, because I think there'll be less need for them in the future if this technology is successful and more widely used.
Can I interject there? You're speaking in the abstract, right? But why not be more concrete, especially to this audience? I mean, who extracts the most money from selling trust?
Western Union.
Well, Western Union, right, explicitly through remittances and money transfer, but all sorts of financial institutions sell trust. That's their job, right?
Yeah.
Except the price of trust. I'm sorry, but the price of trust just plummeted, right? The price of trust just plummeted to pennies, and there's no reason to pay large fees when you're buying trust from financial institutions. That's why I think this is also one of the other killer apps. I mean, I work in crypto equity, representing ownership cryptographically, but there are so many ways to model financial instruments where the trust is mathematical, and you don't need to pay large fees.
Yeah, so I was being a little coded in my statement in part because I think that there's no single existing player that I think needs to fail to this, right? Business models can adapt, and it'll be the ones who don't adapt that will suffer risks from this.
Yeah, great to be in the third slot after those. So to maybe not say like the things that I think are the biggest and baddest, but the things that I think a lot about. One is any type of voting related. I mean, and we've talked about it here in the context of arbitration. And people kind of voicing their opinion on multi-sig type application. That's a very kind of monetary application of it. But I think the idea that people could potentially be voting and never have to worry about their identity or who they're voting for, any of these types of things, I think are very powerful types of vectors that can move in very interesting directions. I think as it relates to kind of karma as like a very high level thing and how it moves around and how people get reputation and how they're certified and kind of their abilities and their skills and their personality and whatever these things are, I think there's really interesting applications. So, and that's kind of a really broadened version of voting and identity and trust. And I think, so anyway, that's kind of on the application type of thing. As it relates to who goes out of business, again, like obviously not any one. The economics of establishing trust have like completely been altered by this. That to the point, like establishing trust used to be something you paid a lot for, and now in theory you should not have to pay for. So I guess just to call one person out, I'll probably get in trouble, but we think like the National Clearinghouse, who's the one who clears your, like says that you went to college here or went to college there, just to pick a personal one. You guys didn't pick anyone specifically, so I'll pick one. It's not a big business necessarily. It's probably not something that lots of people hate, but I think they'll go out of business. So.
I mean, just to get a little bit more incendiary.
Now we're naming names.
Well, maybe this is too grandiose, but I mean, let me ask you, what is a dollar, right? What is a dollar? You don't know, right?
It's a shared fiction.
You don't know because you don't know how many dollars there'll be tomorrow or next year or 10 years. You have no idea. In fact, there's so many people's careers who is composed of predicting how many dollars there'll be next year, right? People read the minutia of what Greenspan, for instance, was famous for, being very cryptic. People didn't know exactly what he meant, how are interest rates going to change. Whole careers are made interpreting the things he said, the cryptic things he said. You don't know what a dollar is, right? But you know what a Bitcoin is. You can look at the code and convince yourself. That's very powerful. And I think the dollar will be the big loser here. I think, and we're seeing this all over the world, and this is something Bitcoin people don't talk about enough. All over the world, I mean, look at Japan. How many yen are they printing right now? Or Europe, or us? It's outrageous, right? Fiat money is going to lose to this, and it's only a matter of time until people look for alternatives. Bitcoin just happens to have the best currency utility of all the alternatives.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. I have somewhere, and I meant to bring it today, I have a $100 trillion Zimbabwe note. It's worth about $2. So yeah, it's fiat currencies in unstable governments are probably going to be one of the and remittances to people in unstable governments, which is why Western Union, I think, is on that list.
I think we still have a long way to go to get there. And one of the nice things about this kind of, really being a game changer is that I don't have to convince you, right? That if Bitcoin achieves these ends, it will achieve these ends, and if it wins out in these places, it will win out because it was superior and because it met people's needs. And so I just need to focus on, making sure it survives long enough to go do that and make it actually deliver on that. I'm glad you're enthusiastic.
And that's our time. So thank you all. And we'll be around and taking individual questions and trading cards. Thank you. Thank you, panel.